Anyway, let's begin with the specific topic that I promised, and that is how policymakers and commentators get the news. To do the paper for my friends in Seoul, I made up my own little survey, and I sent it out to about 30 past and current players, as I said, at State and DOD and the White House and on Capitol Hill, and even a couple of journalists. And I asked 5 basic questions. I said, first, what U.S. media sources do you use to learn about the Koreas, and which are the most useful consistently? And then give me some examples. Number 2, if you had to rely on U.S. media sources, would you have sufficient information to do your job? And if not, how do you supplement it? And do you find the U.S. media actually uses mainly Korean-based sources, things like that? Number 3, what Korean sources or resources do you use to do your job, and which do you find are the most reliable consistently? Number 4, do you utilize a Korea media listserv of some kind? Do you do your own searches? If so, which ones and how often and all that? And then number 5 was, do you find media coverage in general is a useful balance of political and diplomatic and non-proliferation, or is the focus just on too much on one issue? Question number 1, on U.S. media sources and their effectiveness. The consensus of more than 20 respondents who replied was mixed, that it wasn't as bad as you might think, despite the despairing comments of one well-known U.S. expert who's himself frequently called on for comments. He said, if I had to rely on the U.S. media to follow North Korea or inter-Korea relations, I would jump out of a window. Well, a former State Department, he's still alive, by the way, a former State Department official adds to this critique. He says U.S. media report rather poorly on the Korean Peninsula because they report less on Korea than on U.S.-Korea relations. And they're particularly focused on of course, the North Korea nuclear and missile issues and on related intelligence. So they tend, accordingly, to rely heavily on U.S. official sources for the basic story, and to flesh out that with brief quotes or sound bites from U.S. academic and think tank types. So few U.S. media seem to weave into their stories the information from the South Korean media, South Korean official sources, or South Korean academic and think tank experts. So that's a State Department take on it. Now, we note this comment for 2 reasons. It reflects a problem that I think we've really noticed, particularly with some of our major national papers, that they spend a great deal of time reporting the official U.S. view and a great deal less time really trying to find out what's happening in South Korea and putting that into perspective. There are some exceptions. But the fact is that, as we found from our survey, that U.S. policymakers and commentators nearly all rely primarily on their own or others' interpretations of Korean media rather than original work by the U.S. news media. And quite frankly, that surprised me. It's not always true, of course. And in the paper I gave in Seoul, I mentioned several really excellent papers and publications. And I don't want to start a fight here today, but you didn't name me or you didn't name my paper, so I'll leave that one out. On trade, only on trade really, did U.S. players and other journalists feel they had consistently useful U.S.-generated coverage, and that's from Inside U.S. Trade and the Washington Trade Daily, the Washington Post, New York Times, particularly Wall Street Journal, so we all know that. Interestingly, everybody I talked to in and out of government mentioned the Financial Times of London, the Pink Sheet, because it has very sophisticated economic and political coverage of U.S. policy, and it still has actual live correspondence in Tokyo and Beijing. They haven't committed auto-genocide as so many other American units have done. As Prime Minister Winston Churchill once quipped, America and Britain are one people divided by a common language. In any event, the acceptance of the FT by both Washington and Wall Street really eliminates international boundaries. So I also found that almost everybody doing things from the DoD standpoint mentioned defense news as reliable, timely, and invaluable. People even occasionally mention my own report, but that just shows bad judgment, obviously. Second question was, what would you rely on U.S. media, would reliance on U.S. media be sufficient to do your job? And if not, on what do you rely? And sub-questions like that. Overall, a typical assessment came from a former journalist who's now an academic and a commentator. He says, I don't rely on U.S. media to follow developments in North and South Korea. The U.S. media is adequate for coverage of U.S. policy toward the Koreas, but almost useless when it comes to coverage of the peninsula itself. American coverage of Korea is skewed way too much towards one subject, and of course you know what that is, the bomb. This expert goes on to explain, mostly I rely on the Korean media, supplemented by the Japanese media and some online resources. I read the major Korean newspapers online, along with Yonhap. I get the daily press summaries of the Japanese media prepared by the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo, and other correspondents. Respondents noted that our embassy in South Korea provides the same sort of thing. He also regularly reads KCNA and Xinhua, the Chinese news agency. You can see a pattern here. Question 4, are Korea or Korea-related listservs used? And if so, which ones? Well, from what we've been saying, you won't be surprised to learn that virtually everybody involved in the process, as a reporter or an analyst or a decision maker or a commentator, is a frequent and sometimes heavy user of a variety of government, commercial, and sometimes purely labor of love listservs. And by listserv, we mean an electronically gathered and disseminated listing of the latest or currently available news stories, magazine articles, think tank pieces, TV and radio reporting, even book reviews. In short, any organized list of things to read and think about. Because of the foreign policy, defense, and nonproliferation issues at the heart of Korea policy today, the listserv universe is extraordinarily rich. So, conclusion. From my conversations with fellow Korea watchers and active players in various branches of the U.S. government, there was really a consensus that there is vast room for improvement in the individual performance of both U.S. and Korean news editors and reporters, but that if you have the time and the energy, you should be able to get a really good handle on most of what's happening and what it all might mean. And that's also true, but to a more limited extent, for events in North Korea itself. But even then, the resources available, when you include the increasing frankness of Chinese authorities, it really should help improve coverage by the more enterprising U.S. reporters. Now,